Well, good morning. We are working our way through the book of Galatians, the letter that Rav Shaul wrote to the Galatian believers. Do I have my maps up here, Rashad? Can you get the maps up for me? And I don't have my pointer. That would be helpful. So this is Galatia. It was a large province in the greater Roman Empire, and this is what's called Asia Minor. I'd like to see the other map, please, the one that has the whole there we go. And here's Galatia in this area. Here's Israel down here, here's Cyprus, and out there is the Atlantic Ocean. So this just gives us a little sense of where we are geographically. And remember, the reason I'm showing this to you is that Paul spent a lot of time traveling. He was not a homebody. He may have started off as a homebody, but most of his life was spent on a boat, traveling around the Mediterranean Sea. And as I mentioned last week, scholars lately have taken a look at what they call the New Paul. It's the same Paul, but they're taking a new look at the great apostle to the Gentiles. And guess what they found out? He was a Jew, and he practiced Judaism. What a surprise. They always thought of him as St. Paul, the wonderful Catholic. But that's not the way it was. And so he begins this epistle, this letter, to the Messianic communities in Galatia. So he's initially writing to the people in that province I just showed you, called Galatia. And it was part of Asia Minor, and there was a lot of people living there at this time. And he goes on to say, I'm astounded at how quickly you're turning away from what I taught you to what he calls another gospel. He was very upset, very bothered by this. He even used the term desertion. You're deserting the Lord by doing this. So Rav Shaul was not a passive kind of guy. He was like a zealous Jewish man, and he was upset. He was upset. He said that they were at risk of committing heresy like this. So he continues on, and this I'm kind of reviewing for you where we've been. Some of you weren't here the last couple of weeks. And he let the Galatians know that he was not teaching what he was teaching to win a popularity contest. In fact, he had a sense that it might cost him his life, which it ultimately did do. So he was trying to get the people to understand something, that you're not saved by keeping the Torah. You're not saved by keeping the traditions. Salvation is a gift from God. It's a one-time offering for sin. Take it or leave it. Sanctification is the process of behaving differently. So where salvation is one concept, sanctification is another concept. And Rav Shaul was trying to make this clear to the people in Galatia because he was very concerned that they were going to walk away from the Lord. He reminds them that he was really an apostle, even though he wasn't with the original 12, that God called him to preach to the Gentiles. As I mentioned before, I'm sure Paul had some thoughts about this, given the fact that he was a well-trained rabbinical student. He had studied in the top yeshiva in Jerusalem under Gamaliel, the leading rabbi authority in those days. And here Paul is called to go to Gentile land. And I want you to think about that for a second. He sacrificed his life to preach the good news to non-Jews. I don't think that was his preference. He went to seminary to be a missionary to the Jews, if you will. He was a rabbi, he was well-trained, and God changed it all around and said, no, Paul, you're going to go to the Gentiles. You're going to go in the Gentiles. And he says, but you have heard about my former ways in traditional Judaism. He was a big shot, a great student. He was given all kinds of commendations. He probably had a wall of certificates and trophies and so forth and so on. Yet he went and he served God by presenting the good news. We need to remember our callings, folks. Each one of us is called to something. And we need to remember what those callings are and try to activate them in our lives. Just like Paul, who was the apostle to the Gentiles, showed us that he did. So I want to come down to chapter 2 now, which is what we're going to teach about this morning. He tells the Galatians that he spent some time in Galatia and that he also went back to Jerusalem, kind of was summoned back to Jerusalem. So we read in chapter 2 of Galatians, then after 14 years of work in Galatia, I again went to Jerusalem, which is where you might say the whole Messianic movement began, in the heart of Israel, Jerusalem, which would make sense. And he said, I went to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and I took with me Titus. He spent many years working in Asia Minor, starting congregations, starting home groups, educating, edifying the believers, and he did a very successful ministry there among the Gentiles in Galatia. Now he wants the people to know what's happening. So he mentions specifically that he took Titus with him back to Jerusalem to meet with the Jerusalem council. Why did he take Titus with him? Do you know that Titus was not Jewish? Titus was a Gentile who had become a follower of the Messiah. So when Paul goes back to Jerusalem from being in Galatia, back to Jerusalem, he takes Titus with him. This was to prove his point, that God was working among Gentiles and bringing salvation to them, even though they were not practicing Jews, and even though they didn't start practicing Judaism. He had to make a distinction here because his followers in Galatia were getting off track. So he says, I took Titus with me. That was to make a point that God was working among the Gentiles. Guess what? He's still working among the Gentiles. Most of our congregation is made up of Gentiles. Most of the Messianic world is made up of Gentiles. Most of the world is made up of Gentiles. There's only 14 million Jews in the entire world. 14 million, that's like the size of New York City. God is working among the Gentiles and is perfectly within his plan. So the crux of Paul's argument was that you didn't need to keep the Torah to be saved. You could remain as a Gentile and be perfectly fine as being saved. He says in verse 2, I went up to Jerusalem in obedience to a revelation. Now, nobody knows what this revelation he had was. It wasn't necessarily a vision or something from above. He didn't get a letter from God. What was the revelation? It's not clear, but the key thing is he's saying to the Galatian believers to whom he's writing this letter, I was called to Jerusalem. I had no choice. I had to go. It was a revelation. He didn't make this idea up. He didn't say, hey, it's a nice time to be in Jerusalem this time of the year. I'm going to leave Galatia, take a little trip down to Jerusalem, maybe get some nice Jewish food down there and have a little vacation. No, that was not his intention, because he was called to Galatia. He was called to the Gentiles in Asia Minor. But God called him to go to Jerusalem, so he did. So he said, I had to go to Jerusalem to explain to the leadership of the Messianic community in Jerusalem that they had a problem, not seeing that God was reaching out to Gentiles without them having to become Jewish people first through circumcision. Circumcision is an operation on an 8-day-old boy that actually was symbolic of becoming, it's an entrance into Judaism, into the Jewish world, circumcision. So the challenge which the Jerusalem council was to settle had caused much trouble among the congregations in Antioch at the end of Paul's first missionary journey. Certain teachers had come from Jerusalem. In other words, they had left Jerusalem, traveled up to Antioch and into Galatia, and they were stirring things up and causing great deals of trouble. That's why after 14 years of successful ministry among the Gentiles, Paul and his fellow sojourners had to go to Jerusalem to be at the Council of Jerusalem. These were the authorities of the early Messianic community. These were the guys in charge of the entire Messianic world at that time. And they summoned him, they called him, and Paul responded. Maybe he heard a voice from a bat kol, a voice from heaven, I don't know, but something motivated him to go to Jerusalem. Now this is relevant to us today because some people teach that part of salvation is keeping the Torah. But that's not the case at all. Keeping the Torah, listen carefully, is a result of sanctification, of growing in the Lord. Sanctification is like the word holiness, meaning to be set apart for God. And God calls all of us, Jews and Gentiles, to be sanctified in Yeshua. We're saved by his sacrifice, and we're sanctified as we grow in him and learn to walk in his ways. So sanctification is slightly different than salvation. So it's relevant to us today because some people are teaching that now that you're a believer in Yeshua, you must be keeping the Torah. It's not true. You can keep the Torah. It's a way to be more set apart for God, but it's not a requirement salvation. Nobody loses their salvation because they eat a ham sandwich.
Amen.
Just to make that point. So Paul says, I explained to them, the leaders in Jerusalem, the good news as I proclaim it among the Gentiles, but privately I explained to them to the acknowledged leaders. I did this out of concern that my current or previous work might not have been in vain. So he met with the leadership in Jerusalem privately, probably because, my guess is because he knew that they were going to be having a pretty substantial debate, perhaps not in quiet terms. It could have gotten loud because Israelis and Middle Eastern people talk with loud voices, a lot of emotion, a lot of expression. And maybe Paul thought, well, this is likely to turn into a big argument, which it did do. So he wanted to meet with them privately to hash this all out. So he explains to the Galatians that his position was affirmed at the Jerusalem Council. In other words, he's writing to the Galatians after he had been to Jerusalem and met with the leadership of the congregations, and they confirmed and affirmed that, guess what? It's okay. God is doing something among the Gentiles without them becoming Jewish first. He says, but they didn't force my Gentile companion Titus to undergo Brit Milah, circumcision. Indeed, the question came up only because some men who pretended to be brothers had been sneaked in, and they came in surreptitiously to spy out the freedom we have in the Messiah Yeshua so they might enslave us again. Not even for a minute did we give in to them so that the truth of the good news might be preserved for you. He was not going to allow these leaders, he called them so-called believers, to infect the true gospel message, which is basically very simple. Yeshua came into the world, he died for our sins. You have to receive that in order to inherit eternal life. It's a simple message. It gets complicated all the time, as I talked about last week. There's all kinds of different ways that people, 2 weeks ago, where people talk about different kinds of gospels, particularly the social gospel, meaning you got to do things in order to be saved. That's not true at all. So he makes the point that they did not make his friend Titus have to go through circumcision, which proves his point that the Jerusalem Council agreed that you didn't have to become a Jew to be saved. Now, there's a difference between Timothy and Titus. I want to talk about that for a second. He uses Titus as an example that the Jerusalem Council didn't ask Titus to be circumcised, again, a sign of submission to the Torah, and which some were saying had to happen. And the people that may have come to talk to them maybe thought they were doing a good thing, maybe they thought that this was the right way of teaching, but he stood against them. He said, that's not the way it is. Paul had been accused of taking a stand against some of the Pharisee believers in Yeshua who taught that Torah keeping was essential to salvation. Some of them were more concerned about keeping every jot and tittle every external aspect of the Torah in order to be saved, rather than understanding that God was interested more in our internal beings. He was more interested in our spirit than our behavior, even though both were important to him. It was a message of the prophets, the same message of the prophets, because they accused Isaiah's follower. Isaiah accused people in his day of doing all these things beautifully, perfectly, according to Jewish practices, but their hearts were far from God. Paul's focusing on the internal essence of becoming a person of God. Now, so he brings Titus with him to emphasize the point that you didn't have to be Jewish to be saved. Now, what about Timothy? All of you know that Timothy was also a follower of Paul's, a disciple of Paul, but Timothy was different. Remember, Titus was a Gentile. He had a Gentile mother and a Gentile father. Timothy had a Jewish mother. Made a big difference in those days and makes a big difference today. Timothy was different, and Paul didn't want to take this man who had not been circumcised, Timothy, into the world of the Jewish people where you had to be circumcised to participate in certain practices. You couldn't even go to synagogue services if you were not circumcised. So Paul made sure that Timothy was circumcised so that his ministry would flourish. Now, I want to make it clear to you, he did this not to manipulate people or trick Jewish people. He thought, you know what, I should make sure that Timothy is circumcised. Why? His mother was Jewish. And throughout the history of the Jewish people, it's usually the mother that determines whether a person is Jewish. Now, in modern times, Jews are determined patrilineally as well as matrilineally. In other words, if your father is Jewish, you can be considered Jewish nowadays. It's over time, things have changed a little bit. In recent years, the Reform movement, the Reconstructionist movement of Judaism accept both ways of being saved. Being Jewish. Now, when I went to apply for citizenship in Israel about 20 years ago, I think it was now, I knew they were going to ask me if I was Jewish, because Jews are automatically given citizenship in Israel, but they sometimes have to prove they're Jewish. So I had to get my mother's birth certificate from the New York Office of Records. So I got this old yellowed parchment that had been done when I was born in sometime in the past. I was born in 1945. And on it said that my mother was Helen Krasnogor Rubin, a Jewish woman. And they gave me the name Baruch. And I was born at the Jewish Memorial Hospital in New York City, which does not exist anymore, I understand. So the authorities in the Shaliach's office in Jerusalem looked at my paperwork and they said, "You must be Jewish." I said, "Well, I'm telling you, I'm Jewish." Now, I was a believer at the time, but they didn't ask me whether I was a believer or not. They just asked me if I was Jewish, and I said, "Yeah, I'm Jewish." I even pulled out the invitation to my bar mitzvah, and it was held at the Hotel 2400 on 16th Street in D.C. I had all the evidence I needed that I was Jewish, and they said, "Sounds good, we're going to look you up in the computers, come back in a week or two." I came back, and they said to me, "Welcome to the Balagan." Balagan is a Hebrew word meaning confusion. And the clerk understood that when you're part of Israel, you really are part of confusion. It's a difficult world to live in Israel. It's not like the United States where everything is pretty orderly. In Israel, you got chaos half the time. You got people attacking from the left, from the right. You got Arabs, you got Druze, you got everybody mixed in there. It's a crazy world. It's a balagan. It's a bunch of confusion. But she welcomed me to the balagan because she understood after they checked out that I really was an authentic Jew. My mother was Jewish, and that was the main requirement. Paul's teaching about Timothy and Titus was different because, remember, Timothy was Jewish by virtue of his mother being a Jew. She was married to a Roman citizen, but she was a Jew, and therefore Paul said, I need to circumcise Timothy as well. But he made the point that that had nothing to do with salvation. He goes on to say, and when he's speaking about these guys from Jerusalem, he said, what they were makes no difference to me, because God does not judge by outward appearances. These leaders added nothing to my authority. He's referring to the Jerusalem leadership team that confirmed what he was doing, but he said it didn't matter, because they did not add to what I already knew to be true, because God called Paul. God called Paul to the ministry to the Gentiles. So even though that these guys said, okay, it sounds good, Paul, he already knew that it didn't matter in terms of that. However, I want to make it clear to you that Paul was not being disrespectful of their authority or of their status or of their position. He just knew from the get-go that he was chosen to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And these guys coming along and saying, yes, we get that, it was nice, but it wasn't necessary, because Paul understood his calling. He clarified that although the Jerusalem council had determined that Gentiles did not need to keep the law of Moses for salvation, these teachers were now laying this on Gentile believers in Galatia. So he sees things differently than the new false teachers that had come out of Jerusalem and created some problems. He goes on to say, on the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the good news for the uncircumcised, the Gentiles, just as Kepha, Peter, had been called for the circumcised. Since the one working in Kepha to make him an emissary to the circumcised, the Jews, had worked in me to make me an emissary to the Gentiles. It was clear that Kepha, Peter, was called to reach out to the Jews living mostly in Israel, and that just as God had showered Peter with much success, the same thing was happening to Paul among the Gentiles. Who would have figured something like that out? God. God figured that all out. He called this Orthodox Jewish scholar, Paul, to go to the Gentiles, and he called this Jewish fisherman, Peter, to be the apostle to the Jews. It's called ironic. But God has his ways. Got to remember that some things don't make sense. So, there are different people groups in the world that need to be reached. And just to name just a couple of the many, one of the oldest missions is called the African Inland Mission. These are some probably Europeans that went to deepest, darkest Africa and became missionaries to the natives in the land. African Inland Mission. How many have ever heard of Prison Fellowship? This was started by Chuck Colson after he went to prison from the Nixon era. He started a ministry to go to prisons. And I want to tell you something. I've discovered recently that there are actually Jews in prison, and there are many Messianic Jewish groups forming in prisons all over the world, particularly in the United States. And we're trying to reach them. We send them a lot of free literature, free books. Sometimes we've sent taluses, starting little Messianic communities in the prisons in the United States. We get letters every week about this. So to tell you the truth, I'm looking for somebody associated with Emmanuel to help administer our outreach to the prisons in the United States. If you feel any sense of calling to that practice, please let me know. We can talk, because I think there are hundreds of thousands of Messianic Jewish and Gentile people in prisons that need our help. Are you called to them? Now, Peter and Paul, as we're going to learn next week, had quite a bit of a debate about this whole issue. It wasn't simple. As I said, with Jewish people, nothing is simple, especially Israeli Jews. And remember, they were Israeli Jews. This is not St. Peter and St. Paul. These are two Israeli Jews that were feisty, argued about everything. Just the way it is. They debated things. But the one thing they had in common, they preached the Messiah sacrificed for sin. They all agreed on that. And we need to remember something, because we may have differences of opinion how we do things at Emmanuel, or we may have differences of opinion how Emmanuel does things against other congregations, because there are different kinds of Messianic congregations. One that's led by a friend of mine, this is in another part of the country, doesn't allow any Gentiles to be part of the congregation. This is something that I disagree with, because I think that God brought Jews and Gentiles together for a reason, but there are a few congregations around that do not allow Gentiles to either be members or participate in any kind of leadership role. That's just their way of doing things. I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong. It's not how I want to do things, but that's how they want to do things. We have to remember, we're on the same team, and it's a winning team. I'm not going to fight with them. We need to work together to proclaim the good news to the Jewish people as well as the Gentiles. And then Paul closes this section with, what is it, verse 10? Their only request, this is the request of the Jerusalem Council. Remember, he's telling about what happened when he went down to Jerusalem for the council, when he was summoned there and the Lord led him there. He said their only request was that we should remember the poor, which very thing I have spared no pains to do. The section closes with Paul recounting that the leaders of the Jerusalem assembly asked him to remember the poor people, not every poor person, but the poor people among the believers in Jerusalem. This is not a call on the life of Paul to become an organizer of like a focus on the family, food for the hungry, anything like that. He's saying, remember the poor Jews in Jerusalem. Now, why would they conclude their meeting with that statement? Nobody's sure why, but I'm going to suggest some ideas. One is that they wanted to make sure that Paul, living his whole life up there in Galatia, would not forget that he was really a Jew. They wanted him to stay connected to his Jewish roots, even though he was in Gentile land. That's one reason. Secondly, the Jewish believers in Jerusalem were very poor. In fact, all the Jews living in Israel were pretty poor. There weren't that many. Israel's small compared to the Gentile world, which was huge in terms of numbers and assets and wealth. So the idea was that the Gentile world could bring goods and services and money to the Jews in Jerusalem. Remember the poor. Asia Minor was a lot more wealthier than Israel at the time. Other times, Paul mentions that he's collecting money for the Jewish people in Jerusalem, the Messianic Jews. And he says that's a good behavior for all of us to practice. In fact, I'm going to read to you now something from Romans 15:25, that he wrote to the believers in Rome about this very issue. Listen carefully. He says, "But now I am going to Jerusalem with aid for God's people there. For Macedonia and Achaia," these are two provinces of Rome, "thought it would be good to make some contribution to the poor among God's people in Jerusalem. They were pleased to do it," he mentions. "But the fact is they owed it to them, for if the Gentiles," listen carefully, "for if the Gentiles have shared with the Jews in spiritual matters, the Gentiles clearly have a duty to help the Jews in material matters." Paul got it. He said, you know, all the people in Galatia and other parts of the Roman world learned about salvation from the Jews. They learned about the Torah from the Jews. They learned all these spiritual truths from the Jews, and they need to now return money back to the Jewish believers in Jerusalem because they had gotten spiritual blessings, and now they had to return material blessings to the Jewish people back in Jerusalem because they needed a lot of help. So he tells the Galatians that he fully planned to send money back to the poor Jews in Jerusalem. That's just the way he was. And it's something I want to suggest that you might think about. You might think about it. I don't know. I guess some of us have more money. Most of us have more money than most of the people in the world. If you live in America, you can't help it. We're the richest country in the world. And you know, in Jerusalem, in Israel right now, there are Messianic Jewish people that are really suffering, that are not even having enough food. So I want you to think about this and pray about this. And if God shows you a mission, an organization in Israel that you want to support, I suggest you check with me, and I'll check with my sources in Israel and make sure it's a reputable organization. So the money that you would give goes to really helping people, not to paying exorbitant executive director salaries. That's always a problem in the nonprofit world. So I think following Paul's teaching, it behooves us to really give some thought to this practice. Now next week we're going to read how Paul confronted Peter about this theological issue of Gentiles in the body of Messiah. And this is important for our congregation because we're a mixed congregation. And I think it's very important that we tackle the issue of the role of the Torah in the lives of Gentiles. I think it's a confused matter in the Messianic world, and I hope I'm able to straighten it out for us. So we'll be talking about that starting next week in starting at verse 11 in chapter 2. So you can start reading ahead for the next chapter. Now don't forget, after Oneg today, we're going to have a further discussion on the wonderful video that we heard about. That was not Rabbi Foreman, I should have mentioned. That was one of his disciples. And we're going to continue talking about Abraham's faith and what it means for us today. There's a lot of lessons we're going to learn from the